20. All right, let's try that again. Calling to order the Select Board special meeting for March 28th, 2025.
Is Marianne able to join?
This is the Charge and Composition, the
No.
Stephen Palmer Reuse Development Committee.
Okay, well, I'll just summarize then. Since this got started because I was interviewing volunteers for the Stephen Palmer Committee. We have a couple of really good volunteers with relevant experience, but there is an issue of conflict of interest, given that volunteers cannot benefit financially in any way from their activities. So we need to just talk about kind of what we can do to relieve the conflict from these volunteers, and the fact that the conflict appears to extend not only to the volunteers themselves, but to the companies for which they work. And it's unclear, or at least it's unclear whether those individuals can release the conflict for the companies that they work for.
Can I ask a question? Are these people that you've interviewed, are you intending that we appoint them either regardless of the composition, or are we talking about appointing different people if the composition changes?
Well, since the conflict of interest would be the same regardless of their role, I would imagine if we can't release them from the conflict, then they would not be interested. So
they're not interested in serving, knowing that they may be restricted in certain ways.
So I haven't had the interviews. We've just raised the issue of the conflict because since we don't understand, or at least at the time, I didn't understand if we could release them from the conflict. We didn't proceed with the interviews, and we're questioning what the composition should be, so that we don't, put our volunteers into a conflict.
I understand.
So.
Vicky.
I had sent the memo in advance, and I just wanted to see if it's helpful if I walk through it, if people had questions about it.
I would find that helpful. I thought the memo was good, but I would love to have your color commentary on it.
Okay. So to Josh's question, we didn't move forward with interviewing applicants because these questions kind of came up. So we kind of just paused and wanted to make sure that we had a full sense of what the questions were that the board would have to grapple with. So just to walk through, there's really two sets of conflicts. So the first one is for an appointed committee member while they are actually serving. And this is under Mass General Law, Chapter 268A, Section 19. And really that prohibition is that any municipal employee, including an appointed committee member, can't act in a matter for which they or their employer has a financial interest. And so in the current charge of the Stephen Palmer Committee, the two at-large members have a caveat that says one of whom has experience in housing development, one of whom has experience in real estate development. Now, this is a visioning process, so we don't know what the conclusion will be, but since one of the conclusions could be a recommendation that the Stephen Palmer site be redeveloped as housing or as a public-private partnership, fundamentally, there's a question that somebody who has that type of employer could get appointed and have this issue while they're serving. So under Section 19, there's kind of two ways to alleviate or cure that conflict. The first is generally if a committee member is required from a particular industry, if the financial interest kind of uniformly applies to that entire industry, there's an exemption for that. We did discuss this with town council, and I think a good example of when the exemption, this is my example, not town council's, might apply is, the contractor that has been appointed to the tree committee. That tree committee is really looking at like very general policy matters that likely are to impact kind of all properties uniformly, all contractors uniformly. And so it seems like this exemption would apply in that circumstance. Town council had paused that it would apply in this circumstance because the charge of the committee is narrow, kind of about a particular site, and it's a particular niche within development as opposed to kind of all residential development generally. And so, you know, the specifics of who the person is, who their employer is, and how likely they are for this to be aligned with their kind of work would matter in determining if that exemption applies. But I think we should assume that it would not apply, so that then you all as a board can give some consideration to the second way that this conflict could be cured under Section 19. And that's for the board to make a determination that the volunteers' financial interest is not so great as to be likely to affect the integrity of their service. So this finding would be done about a specific appointee. It wouldn't be kind of a general, you know, statement of the board up front, where you would have the details of the recommended candidate and their employer, and you'd really be making a judgment on the specifics of that case and basically a character judgment that you feel like they could do the work, and not have a conflict.
I guess so, maybe I'm jumping ahead to the next one, but if that might be okay at the outset, but then if that company were to be interested in the property, then that all falls apart, or that company is simply barred from it. So it feels to me like the second part, the ongoing conflict, or the conflict that happens even after the committee, kind of drives the bus on this.
Okay, I can walk through that part. So that second conflict exists after the work of the committee has concluded. And, you know, this is kind of a worst case scenario, but I think that's our job to try to think through those things on the front end. So on this scenario, it's that the at-large members do work for a development company. The committee ultimately recommends that Stephen Palmer be redeveloped for kind of housing or a public-private partnership. The town issues an RFP because the select board has agreed with that recommendation, and ultimately the volunteer's employer bids on the RFP. So a lot of things have to line up for that to happen. But if that were to be the outcome, then the conflict of interest law, the prohibition is under Section 18 of Chapter 268A, and because the volunteer has worked on the matter on the committee, they can't ever financially benefit directly or indirectly from that work. And so I think the two things that kind of came out as we were talking about this, first is, you know, ultimately it's the action of their employer that would put them into a conflict or not, right? I don't know kind of these individual applicants or potential additional applicants that we get if they have decision-making authority within their companies. But if they can't definitively decide for their company that they are not going to apply in the future, then, you know, they would be at risk that by act of their employer bidding on the RFP outside of their control, that they then would be in conflict. The second matter that came up was kind of the town's role in this. And so when we issue RFPs, we can put in evaluation criteria. Kind of in the conversations we've had, I think it would be very challenging to put in a criteria that precludes a particular bidder. And so the town might be in a position where this volunteer's employer bids, and if kind of all of the other evaluation criteria bear out that that applicant is the best, most advantageous bidder for the town, we may be in a position where we have to award that bid, and again, be placing that volunteer then in conflict, kind of outside of their control.
I guess I see something beyond just placing the volunteer in conflict. I see that it looks bad for the town and that it creates mistrust in our process, which I think we would all want to avoid, you know, beyond what it does to the individual.
Yeah,
How-
can we write an RFP where we're excluding an employer because of an employee. I mean, that's a thin reed to go on.
I wouldn't want any unintended consequences of somebody's employment status being jeopardized. Again, this is a worst case scenario, but it's just not something that I think is commonly done.
All right, here's a thought. Could these members of the committee, they could be members of the committee but non-voting? Does that take the pressure off? I mean, they're still advising, but they're providing homework. But are they?
Isn't it about having inside information with which to influence the bidding process? Or
Well, I mean, anyone sitting in the meetings could have discerned. what was
true.
going
I mean, they're
on.
all public, but if they're named,
And so if they were non-voting, then they can say, I never took a vote that influenced this. Does that keep them clean?
I think oh, sorry. I see Dave's hand is raised. Look,
Oh,
go ahead, Dave.
Dave, go ahead.
I was just going to remind you that if there's a potential for conflict and you're serving on a committee, you excuse yourself. You actually have to vacate the room and not participate to imply that your presence could impact decisions. So I would assume the same difficulty here as a person contributing to the committee's decisions stuff, even if they didn't vote, could put them at jeopardy.
Okay.
And to add
looks like
just
Josh has
that,
something too.
You please finish, Katie.
I just wanted to add that the conflict of interest law applies to municipal employees, and you take on that status when you are appointed to a committee. So I think voting status or not isn't the relative deciding factor. But I think one of the options, we had put for the board to consider is, you can engage consultants through the public engagement process, or inviting, having focus groups or some other way where you can get that expertise without it being somebody that you appointed as a member.
No, actually, it was Josh who was
Josh.
raising his hand.
Oh,
Oh, thank you.
George, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about like why I liked the original composition. It was because look, land use is kind of tricky, and there are all sorts of permutations and combinations and possibilities. And I like the idea of having experts on there. I wonder if, like, keeping all this in mind, we can advertise it, let people know of the conflict, and if people are willing to accept it, then that can be a benefit to the committee by having them on it. If we advertise it widely and we still find no one who's willing to accept that they are restricted in certain ways from bidding on this particular property in the future, then we can look to change things.
I don't think that the individual can speak on behalf of their company is the problem.
Well, but we don't know what the form is. Like maybe it's a sole proprietor. Maybe they own the company. Maybe they're retired. Like they're just all sorts of permutations where there could be, a legal conflict, but it applies only to this one parcel that the conflict in practice would never arise.
Right.
So
Retirees was something we were sort of talking about. And I mean, we could certainly have housing, or we could have volunteers who have housing or development experience, but no relevant affordability component. Because it seems unlikely that an RFP with someone who didn't have an affordability component would move forward, unless, of course, it doesn't turn into housing, in which case all bets off.
I guess I didn't understand the last part about affordability.
Well, if this were to become housing, because it is affordable now, it's reasonable to assume that it would have some affordability component in the future. If we only had individuals with experience in development and building or planning, but no affordability component, like on the part of their company, then perhaps that would remove some of the risk, but we don't even know that it's going to become housing. So, it's like a little overgamed, I think.
I guess, I don't know, my reaction is looking at this, the simplest thing is just to go to 2 members at large and get the expertise some other way. Just also in part, just with sort of the climate of things now, I totally appreciate, Josh, your point that we need the expertise. I'm just wondering if we can get it some other way. Just because if people feel like, let's say the committee ends up recommending some sort of public-private partnership or some sort of housing development, and then people go back and look and they say, oh, well, this is sort of this insider game, and you have somebody from the industry that's pushing this, and I guess I'm sensitive to that sort of a thing. Whereas if the expertise is provided on more of an arm's length, totally objective way from a consultant, then you don't have that appearance. And this stuff is just tricky. Like this stuff that's almost perpetual afterwards. I think that's really hard to know up front. That point number 2. And, if there is a way to get the expertise some other way, I guess I'd be more comfortable with it and really try to avoid the potential conflict of interest at all, not only for those people's sake, but also just for the way it looks publicly and the kind of trust that it would engender. Because inevitably, some people will be happy with the way this turns out, and some people will not be happy. And we don't want people to think that somehow there was any corrupt influence.
I think, yes, I think that's another option. So if we go that way, it changes, in my mind, kind of the nature of the committee a little bit. It becomes more general and kind of an ideation type thing. And I'm just thinking about the timeline. I mean, the lease is up in 2 years. In my mind, it kind of changes the shape of the committee. So we could do that, condense it a little bit and make sure the scope is just kind of thinking about what we want to do. And then maybe it's a different committee or a different format. We have to be more
We're going to have a
specific.
consultant that could, on the second half as well, like what should it be and how should that work? We're going to have a subject matter consultant, right? So wouldn't that serve the purpose anyway? I mean, this was sort of icing on the cake all around.
The committee, you mean?
The expertise on the committee was icing on the cake because we were going to have consultants on both committees that were subject matter experts, and we're going to be leading this charge anyway. So this was just, extra expertise, local expertise.
Katie, you had a thought?
Yes, just to confirm that the procurement for the consultant to work with this committee, the expertise would have to include that the consultant would have to know about public-private partnerships, and they are land use professionals and community engagement professionals. So I think we do have at a minimum, we will hire, whoever we hire will have that expertise. And the committee is also going to be staffed by the planning and community development staff, and in terms of kind of their level of knowledge around this.
Yeah. No, I guess I liked that icing, but I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all wanted to keep the expertise on the committee, and frankly, these volunteers were really awesome. So it really is a shame and a loss. However, I don't know that we, obviously we as the town don't want to take on the responsibility of potentially putting these people in conflict in perpetuity. It just seems not worth it, the trade-off. So since we have consultants with the subject matter expertise that we need, I guess I would make a motion to change these 2 seats to at-large seats.
I would second that.
I just want to clarify, the town isn't taking responsibility for putting anyone in conflict. I still think it's up to the appointee to accept the law that they have to abide by the conflict of interest law. I do appreciate your point, Kathy, that we don't want it to appear in any way that we're setting something up, even if it's in retrospect. We don't want to appear that way. If we go this way and do it as 2 at-large, it should be just residents at large without any particular expertise. Can we have them? Can they be? I don't know how to phrase this. but like residents in proximity, like not a butter certainly, but people in the neighborhood who know the area. Is that something we don't have to put in the charge, but is that something that you can look for, Heidi?
I mean, sure, we could think about it. I don't know that we would make a choice based on that, but I mean, I certainly think that if anyone if anyone from the neighborhood applies, they'll certainly be considered, and their input into the project would be welcomed. But I can't
Well,
guarantee that we're going to have that though.
No, the reason why I think by having it resident at large, it is an ideation committee. It's just about like, what do we want in this neighborhood? How do we
But
want the area to look?
Yeah, but I think that's basically the charge of the committee in the first place.
I guess I understood that differently. Like I understood the committee to be a bit more technical. Like, what would it take, if we wanted to, redevelop the property and have a new land lease, if we wanted to, turn into a park, if we wanted to, apply for grants, grant funding to redevelop in a certain way. I thought of the committee differently.
Well, I mean, the first line of the charge is engaging the community and stakeholders and citizens' participation to envision the future of the property.
Yeah.
So,
But
I mean, yeah, I think there, it goes on to talk about sort of more specifics, but I do think that's the main idea.
Katie, you had a thought?
I just, before you vote, if you're going to, I just wanted to relay that I did have a chance to talk to Mary Ann, and I wanted to make sure that her perspective, although it can't be iterative, is included here. So she was willing to look at 2 at-large candidates and kind of change the expertise from being required to preferred, and letting the applicants decide on themselves if they have a conflict of interest issue and otherwise move forward. I mean, I think that does get at if there's a retiree out there or somebody who owns their company and truly can make that decision, that conflict number 2 would never arise. So just wanted to share her perspective.
I think that
Sounds
might
good.
be an elegant way to get around it. I mean, if you could find a retiree who had that knowledge and who there was no possibility of a conflict, that would be wonderful and ideal. But then you wouldn't be forced into that box, but you could still kind of look for it. I mean, if, that seems like a good solution to me.
So could we maybe amend your motion, Heidi, just a little bit to reflect Mary Ann's feedback? Basically, it's keeping it the same, 2 members at large who are preferred to have experience.
Sure.
Yeah. Preferred but not required. And they would choose the risk. They would understand it. Okay. Is someone gonna second that as amended?
I'll second that.
Okay. All right, let's have a vote. We have to do roll call. So Josh,
Yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
Heidi.
Yes.
Yes. All right, we've amended.
Great.
Is there anything else?
So
I had,
I
sorry.
well, just so I do feel like I'm going to reach back out to both of these people, let them know that the charge has changed, give them some guidance on what that change really means, and advise them that if they still wish to proceed, then we can set up an interview.
Right. And if not, then Miles, you're gonna go throw the net out again, right?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and I'll work with Katie and with Amy to make sure that we can advertise this in the appropriate places, especially if we're looking for, as the board mentioned, someone who may be retired but has these skills.
Right. Okay.
Great.
It could be anyone, but yeah. Okay. Very good. All right, I could stay here all day.
I did have one tiny logistical question, which is we've been trying to schedule all these meetings and I just looked at my calendar and it said there was a select board meeting at 9 o'clock this morning. Is that this? Did that get moved to this or? Like, I don't know why I have that on my
That
calendar.
you just must have. No, that's,
Yeah,
that
you
is-
didn't
that's
have that
just-
one.
Okay, It's a ghost.
I'm
We were
sorry.
all there, Kathy, we were all there. It was a great meeting. We voted on many things. All
Your
right,
next meeting is Tuesday at 6.
Thank you.
6 o'clock. I was off, okay. All right.
I move to adjourn.
Second,
All right. Josh,
Yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
Heidi,
yes.
and the chair votes yes. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.